72 hours is a lifetime when the clock is counting the wrong way. At 7:00 a.m., on an ordinary Chicago morning in late 1982, a family reaches for relief, the way America has done for decades: a white bottle, a red label, a promise. By noon, an ER physician will stare at a monitor that refuses to make sense. By nightfall, press conferences will carry a single instruction across the country: do not take extra-strength Tylenol. This is the hour-by-hour story of how a week of terror rewired every medicine bottle in your cabinet. At 06:45, the first call brings a 12-year-old girl to the hospital with symptoms that look like nothing, and everything sudden collapse seizure of vital line that drops as if someone has cut its cord. The team moves as one airway IV labs. The family's last hour replays, in fragment school shoes by the door, a sore throat, a single capsule, and a glass of water at a kitchen counter that still holds the morning's cereal bowls. In the trauma bay, monitors alarm, then quiet, then alarm again. The doctor's hand rests on the cart longer than it should. He is trained to explain. He cannot. At 10:00 in a suburb miles away, a 20-something postal worker leaves his shift with a headache and the same faith in an over-the-counter fix. 2 capsules, a breath, a pause. Then the floor moves. In the ER, he arrives pulseless. A second family will stand in the hallway outside a curtain they aren't allowed to touch. Death certificates are not written by time of day, but the second hour will feel like a pattern trying to be born. By 12:00, the newsroom rhythm wakes up. Wire editors hear sudden collapse, young no history. Reporters call hospitals that won't talk, and police who don't yet know there's something to talk about. In kitchens across the region, white bottles stand innocent on countertops. At a drugstore on a busy corner, a clerk is told to reface the analgesics aisle, which is to say, tidy the exact shelf that will soon be empty. At 13:05, another collapse. This time, the victim survives long enough to speak. A spouse answers the same questions twice. Was there pain? What did you take? How many? The words, extra strength, Tylenol surface, not like a clue, but like small talk in a room that hates small talk. A nurse writes the brand name on a clipboard because the brain loves patterns and because everything has to be written down by someone before it can scare anyone. At 14:20, in a quiet county lab, a toxicologist opens a vial and smells something that doesn't belong in a human being. Bitter almond. Not everyone can detect it, but those who can never forget it. He runs the test because reflex beats doubt. The readout prints its verdict in numbers precise enough to terrify cyanide at a concentration that is not a slip, not a trace, not an accident. He calls the ER then, the medical examiner. He repeats himself until his voice sounds like a recording. At 15:00, the story stops being medical and becomes industrial. Police officers in shirt sleeves load into unmarked cars and head for kitchen tables and bathroom cabinets. A detective in a tie that doesn't match his suit holds up a bottle and asks when it was bought and where. He notes lot numbers. He learns the shape of a safety seal that in 1982 is more aspiration than promise. He peels thin foil with a gloved hand. He reads the instructions on the label as if they might contain a line that says, "Do not take if poisoned." At 16:10, the second ER remembers the first. The phone line between hospitals sings its ugly duet, Young Sudden Tylenol. A clerk with perfect penmanship writes 2 addresses on a yellow pad and circles them. A sergeant who has worked every kind of case except this one orders the simplest test a city can run: pull every bottle in both homes, bag and tag, and do it now. By 17:00, Chicago is a rumor machine. Newsrooms still smell like cigarettes and hot plastic. Scanners crackle with half-facts. A TV assignment editor says the word tampering out loud and tastes how it lands in a room. The first live truck rolls without a script. A city desk tells a reporter to talk fast and say little. The first stand-up happens outside a hospital lobby no one wants on camera. Viewers at home see a confident face under fluorescent lights and hear the most honest sentence journalism can produce on a deadline we're learning as we go. At 1830, the medical examiner's lab no longer whispers. It testifies. Cyanide in gastric contents, in blood, in time-course profiles that line up across victims who never met. The one thing they shared is sitting inside millions of American homes. A police commander who normally chooses words like a careful man chooses shoes says sabotage and murder to a bank of microphones that gives those words to the nation. A brand name follows. The effect is chemical panic replicates. At 19:00, a grocery store manager receives a call that runs colder than any freezer aisle. Pull the product. Now. He hangs up and starts walking. His assistant is already halfway down the drug aisle, arms full of white bottles. In 1,000 stores in 100 towns, clerks build small mountains of a familiar object now turned into evidence. They do not know they are staging a national product recall in slow motion. At 2015, a press conference pulls the region into one room. Officials stand behind a podium with flags to prove their seriousness. The medical examiner explains cyanide in sentences that were meant for textbooks, not living rooms. The police chief asks for calm, and in the act of asking confirms the opposite. A corporate spokesperson reads a statement written by lawyers and crisis managers who are reading from their own playbooks for the first time. The message that matters is short enough to survive the distance from television to kitchen. Do not take extra-strength Tylenol. At 21:00, the phone company's switches flicker under the weight of calls. Poison control volumes spike. Emergency rooms prepare for another kind of surge. Worried well, a phrase that sounds cruel until it saves resources for the truly sick. Anxious parents line up at pharmacy counters with a bottle in one hand and a question in the other. What do we do? Pharmacists speak the way pilots speak, through turbulence, calm, controlled, enlisted by circumstance, into the role of counselor. At 22:30, an investigative unit detective's FDA agent's corporate security gathers around a table that will be a war room by morning. They draw lines between addresses and store registers, between lot codes and distribution centers. After an hour, the pattern becomes geography. The affected bottles cluster in a single metro area. Someone says, the most hopeful, terrible sentence of the night, this started close to here. If true, it means the sabotage didn't come from an assembly line 1,000 miles away. It means a person drove to a shelf, replaced capsules with poison, and put death back under fluorescent light. At 23:59, a newsroom graphics operator builds a map with red dots that will become the evening news's most famous animation. A crawl at the bottom of the screen invents a new caution for a new century product tampering. Editors argue about whether to show a brand name on air. They lose the argument to the public interest. Anchors learn to say cyanide without flinching. At 01:00, when most cities pretend to sleep, patrol cars do the opposite. Officers visit pharmacies with lists. Managers hand over anything a badge asks for. A shuttered drugstore opens its doors to a detective with a master key cause. Inside, shelves gape like pulled teeth. The evidence room at headquarters begins to look like a warehouse. A property clerk writes faster than he can file. At 03:15, a call comes from an airline stewardess's apartment. She has been found on the floor bottle on the counter glass nearby. The apartment's HID lights let a late-night camera make her kitchen universal, clean, ordinary, tragic. She becomes the face in viewers' heads when the morning shows begin. At 05:30, the first radio hits reset the public's day. Morning commuters get instructions with traffic and weather. The city's paper arrives with headlines the size of winter. Schools and offices debate whether to send memos or set the news channel on low volume in break rooms and hope. Common sense spreads faster than fear. At 07:00, 24 hours in the ERs are calmer than they should be. It isn't over. It is merely organized. The death count holds at a number no one says twice. The investigation has a shape bottles, lot stores roots. The company will make a decision that changes corporate, crisis, management. Forever pull every bottle, everywhere. The word recall becomes a hammer. The shelf becomes a nail. At 0830, the press conference moves from regional to national. The message is the same and bigger stop, check, dispose report. In living rooms and kitchens and offices, America learns a new ritual: look for seals. Ask about tamper-evident packaging, never assume a cap is a guarantee. The technology isn't there yet. By the end of the week, it will be. At 09:00, an anchor uses a phrase that will define the rest of the story: the Tylenol Murders. It isn't a legal term. It's the only label large enough to hold the nation's fear. Behind that label, investigators run a race no one trained for: catch the saboteur, stop the copycats, keep the public from poisoning itself with panic. Somewhere in the city, a person knows how the capsules were opened and resealed. Somewhere in a lab, a chemist teaches a room full of agents what cyanide does to cells. Somewhere in a boardroom, a CEO signs a document that will cost a fortune and save a brand. By 10:00, the second day begins to look like a strategy. The first day belonged to chaos. The second belongs to systems. In the newsroom, a producer tapes a countdown above her monitor: 48:00. It is not a deadline. It is a prayer that the next 2 days will bring order, accountability, and a single answer to the only question that matters: who put death in a bottle and why. At 10:00 a.m. on day 2, the story stops being local and becomes a logistics operation the size of a small war. Pallets manifests forklifts. Johnson & Johnson's crisis room phones on speaker maps on walls lands on a decision that will be taught in business schools for decades: pull the product. Not some lots. All of it. 31 million bottles. The word recall leaves a conference line in New Jersey and spreads through wholesaler switchboards like voltage. By 10:30, store managers across the country are taking the same call: clear the shelves, isolate stock lock back rooms. In a warehouse outside Chicago, a foreman who has never thought about poison in his life signs a chain of custody form and watches a forklift raise a pyramid of white bottles that yesterday meant relief and today mean evidence. On a loading dock, a driver drapes a blanket over a Gaylord carton as if modesty could protect it from headlines. At 11:05, the FDA, local police, state police, and federal agents crowd a table and redraw the case on butcher paper. The lab's math is no longer a mystery. Capsules, not tablets. Cyanide, not factory contamination. Shelf-level tampering, the kind you can do with a pocket knife and nerve. The old packaging begins to look like a relic. One agent circles the word capsules and says the unromantic truth out loud: they're easy to open and reseal. Noon. The mayor steps to the podium with the medical examiner, the police superintendent, and a corporate spokesperson who reads from a page that will end up in every comms training deck for the next 40 years. Do not consume. Return or discard. We will replace. In living rooms, the message is received not as PR, but as permission to be scared, to be careful to purge a cabinet. In pharmacies, tamper evident goes from jargon to ritual in under an hour. At 12:45, a family in Elk Grove Village says the names that will become the public face of grief: a 12-year-old girl who thought relief came in red and white, a young postal worker whose headache was ordinary until it wasn't, a brother and his wife who died at a kitchen table in a house where everyone had gathered to mourn the first loss. Reporters speak softly. Violins stay in their cases. A newsroom chooses restraint and wins. 13:20. At corporate, the CEO, calm clear. No hedging goes on national TV. He says, "we more than I." He says replacement, cooperation, safety, the kinds of nouns that travel well between scenes of panic and scenes of procedure. The press asks how much this will cost. He says, that isn't the question. In offices across the industry, executives watch and learn the difference between damage control and stewardship. 14. Und Rauerd. In a dry room with humming refrigerators, a chemist explains to a camera how cyanide kills binding to the cellular machinery that turns oxygen into energy. The analogy fits the medium a plug pulled from the wall. The lesson is cold but necessary. Investigation needs vocabulary as much as it needs warrants. 1430. A packaging engineer holds a meeting with a name that sounds like a promised triple seal. Shrink band around the cap, foil over the mouth, glue-sealed carton. Tamper-resistant will be the term of art. Tamper-evident will be the culture. Drawings become prototypes. Prototypes become purchase orders. In footage from a plant floor 2 weeks later, a camera will linger on a ring of clear plastic, hugging a white cap, the way a new habit hugs the public imagination. 1510. In the evidence lab, opened bottles line up like a class picture. Some show the smallest injuries, foil, lifted corners, neat cotton disturbed with a careful hand. Others are sloppier powder on lip threads, micro-tears in seals that read as haste. A detective writes 2 hands in his notebook and draws a bracket same person, different day, or different people, same instructions. The copycat question has arrived. 1600. The tip line is a weather system. Calls about suspicious men in aisles, calls about boxes left in vestibules, calls about bottles that felt wrong. Most are fear learning to speak. A few carry specifics you can hang a warrant on where on the shelf, which register lane, what hour. The task force splits. One team rides the geography of the retail map. Another follows the chemistry. Under 40. In New Jersey, a letter sorter's hands pause over an envelope addressed to the manufacturer. Inside, a typewritten demand and a claim of responsibility, pay to stop the killings, phrased in a way that sounds like theater and reads like extortion. The envelope routes through corporate security to the FBI in under an hour. Postmark analysis, paper and typeface. Fingerprints the sender didn't mean to leave. A name will eventually attach to the letter. James William Lewis will be convicted of extortion tied to it. The murders will remain officially unsolved. Say it twice, the narrator tells himself. Let the record be as precise as the lab. 1715. Back in Chicago, detectives run the retail chain backwards from the affected homes, purchase dates, store cameras that capture aisles, but not fingers. Register tapes with line items and times that erase themselves if you wait too long. The idea of supermarket footage saving a homicide case is years in the future. In 1982, you're mostly betting on memory and luck. 1805. The newsroom switches to wall. Graphics evolve a map replacing dots with expanding circles to suggest risk without promising spread. Anchors coordinate with FDA spokespeople to demonstrate safe disposal. On a side desk, a producer writes copy for Crawl, Nationwide. Recall. Hexiels do not take capsules. In kitchens, viewers move from fear to action, flipping bottles to read lot codes and shaking their heads at their own caution, which is exactly what public health messaging hopes for. 1930. The task force adds chairs, postal inspectors because of the letter, treasury agents because money has entered the room, corporate investigators because distribution maps live on their servers, not in police files. A veteran homicide lieutenant writes 3 columns on a legal pad. How, where, who. Under how, he writes opened capsules. Under where, he writes store shelf. Under who he draws a line he intends to fill with a face, and under the face, a reason. 20 Özrü. In a living room, a family watches a press conference and sees their loss reflected with care. In a newsroom, a researcher builds a timeline that merges medicine retail and grief. In a plant, a packaging line pauses for retooling. In a lab, a spectrophotometer reads the same cyanide peak it read yesterday and will read tomorrow. Cases this large feel personal and systemic at the same time. That's why they change law, not just policy. 21. 10. Another letter, this one to a TV station, threats bravado, the posture of someone who wants the mirror more than the money. The station hands it to the police. The police hand it to the lab. The lab refuses to be hypnotized by adjectives. Ink paper alignment. The postal inspectors run down where the envelopes were sold, because envelopes have origins too. 2 Özür. The company announces a swap program turn in capsules, take tablets. Drive-through tents appear in parking lots. Folding tables become small stages of public reassurance. Pharmacists demonstrate how a seal should look and sound when it breaks. You can hear relief learning its new vocabulary. 45. In a motel 2 states away, agents knock on a door tied to the extortion letter's return address. A man answers with the posture of someone who knows the difference between leverage and possession. Interrogations begin that will end in a courtroom, but not with a murder conviction. The public will conflate and correct, conflate and correct, and the narrator will keep saying the sentence that keeps an honest documentary honest. The person convicted in connection with the letter was not convicted of the murders. Day 306. 30. The recall looks like a national migration in reverse, product leaving homes and stores, entering centralized spaces to be logged and destroyed. Reporters ride with trucks and produce the only kind of optimistic footage this story can credit removal. The anchor's voice takes on a new verb: changed. Changed how we package, changed how we trust, changed what sealed means. EO8, EO0. Legislators say what legislators say when a gap becomes a headline: we need a law. Staffers draft language that will soon become the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, criminalizing product tampering at the level the crime deserves. The bill won't bring names, it will bring teeth. The camera lingers on a fountain pen signing a document because sometimes symbolism is literal. 0920. In a conference room, detectives rehearse the case for themselves. Why Chicago proximity opportunity confidence? Why capsules not tablets access? Why these stores habit? Why these victims? Randomness is a cruelty that doesn't sell on television, but it sits at the center of this story and has to be said out loud. A whiteboard fills with arrows. The eraser keeps close. 10 Honward. The public has learned the choreography inspect reject return. The industry has learned its parallel dance warn recall redesign. The investigation runs on 2 rails, one chasing the letter writer's trail through banks and bus stations, the other walking every aisle, in every store, within a radius that is starting to feel less like a circle and more like a person's routine. Somewhere inside that routine is a car, a hand, a pocket knife, and an hour the city can't account for. 11:35. A producer builds a segment called The Bottle in Your Cabinet. It's not sensational. It's service journalism: how to check safety bands, how to read foil domes, how to spot a cap that's been off and on again. The segment will be rerun for months. It will outlive panic and become habit. 12. And hours. 48 hours since the first warning hit the air. The death toll has stopped climbing a sentence that must be spoken with reverence because it contains families. The recall is now muscle memory. The case has leads with names and leads with none. The country has a new reflex: before you swallow, you look. The camera returns to the newsroom clock and adds back what the city lost control, not certainty. Part 3 begins when the manhunt narrows to a handful of names, when patrol cars watch pharmacy aisles, when a typewriter ribbon tells a story its author didn't mean to share, and when the question that terrifies every investigator enters the script: what if the person who did this is finished? Day 3, 12:01 p.m. The recall is muscle memory. Now shelves, bareback rooms, locked pallets moving in reverse from point of sale to quarantine. What replaces crisis in an investigation is pattern, and the pattern the task force draws is cruelly simple capsules, shelf-level tampering Chicago area, clustering victims who share only the ordinary habit of trust. In the command room, a lieutenant prints the new word on the whiteboard in letters big enough for the whole table to read: MANHUNT, 12:20. Patrol cars cruise retail strips not for robberies, but for aisles. Plainclothes officers lean on end caps, watch hands that reach, watch eyes that flick to cameras and back. Store managers walk with clipboards and new instincts. A crooked seal is no longer stock damage. It's a 911 call. A detective tells his team to photograph before they touch. Not because a case is made on camera, but because memory lies when fear edits it. 13:05. In the lab, examiners line up the recovered bottles and drill into the micro. Foil domes with strange lift patterns, cotton wads disturbed with care thread powder on necks. What they want is a fingerprint. What they get is behavior. Behavior can be enough. On a legal pad, a tech writes the same observation 3 ways until it feels like evidence whoever did this practiced. 13:40. The newsroom leans into its new role as public tutor. An anchor holds a sealed bottle, turns it beneath studio lights, shows the ring, the foil, the glue on the carton flap. This is what normal looks like, she says. Anything else is a reason to walk away. On screen, a lower third promises updates every half hour. In kitchens, viewers rehearse the twist and pull of a safety band they had never before noticed. 14:15. A photo editor enlarges a frame from a drugstore security camera into the day's clearest heartbreak, a flight attendant buying a bottle hours before she will be found on her apartment floor. The cashier's head is half turned. The camera's analog interlace leaves the moment with a hum that feels like prophecy. The timeline clicks: time of purchase, time of intake, time of collapse. The gap in between is where the hunt has to live. 1500. Tips pour in with 2 flavors, fear and certainty. Fear says, I think certainty says I know. Both travel on the same phone lines and arrive in the same spiral notebooks. A bartender remembers a customer who spoke too easily about cyanide. A neighbor swears a man down the block buys chemicals by the gallon. A grocery clerk says a shopper returned a bottle with an apology that didn't match his face. Detectives triage with a new muscle, plausible possible performance. Factor 45. In a fluorescent briefing room, the feds lay down their lane, the extortion letter. It arrived at corporate yesterday, typewritten cold. A demand, a promise to stop the killings for a price. The document examiners have their toys outline spacing strike patterns, the way a type bar kisses paper and leaves a telltale bruise. Postal inspectors hold up the envelope like it can still answer questions if asked the right way. A bank account number buried in the text points to a name the sender may have wanted them to see. Whether the sender is a murderer or an opportunist, the law has a word for the letter crime. 16:20. The cameras move from ERs to evidence tables. A toxicologist explains cyanide again, this time simpler. It turns oxygen into decoration. Your cells can't use it. An anchor nods in a way that makes the lesson live long enough to ride home in a viewer's head. The graphics department redraws the retail map. The cluster holds. If this started on shelves, it started with a person who knew the terrain. What times are quiet? Which stores run thin on staff, where the cameras stare at candy instead of medicine? 1700. The first name to carry weight on the whiteboard doesn't come from a lab. It comes from a mouth. A bartender who watched the news recognizes a regular who talks chemistry like gossip. Detectives follow the lead the way you should follow most bar leads, with care. They find a workbench. They find books. They find the kinds of containers a hobbyist uses and a prosecutor dislikes. They do not find a bridge from hobby to homicide. The whiteboard gains and then loses a circle. It happens 3 more times before midnight. In 10, the company runs a town hall live. The CEO stands next to engineers and a line drawing labeled Triple Seal. He talks not about stock price, but about trust shrink band foil glued carton. He says the bottles will come back to shelves when they can announce themselves, honest at a glance. The crowd does not clap. They nod. It is a different kind of consent. 19. A word. In a small apartment 2 states away, a man watches the press conference and thinks about letters. He knows how to make one sound like leverage. He also knows the difference between leverage and possession. The postal inspectors, who know the same difference, follow the extortion paper trail across counters and sorters to a name that will soon occupy cameras for the wrong reason. When handcuffs close, they will close on an extortion suspect, not a murderer. The narrator says it early, and often he will be convicted of the letter, not the killings. 1945. Copycats arrive like aftershocks. A bottle in another city tastes wrong. A capsule in a different brand looks wrong. The labs triage as ruthlessly as the tip line. Some scares are panics in search of a cause. Some are real. Some are ugly jokes with criminal outcomes. The task force adds a new word to the board noise. It doesn't mean ignore. It means test, then decide. 2030. Surveillance evolves. Stores cooperate with a choreography that didn't exist last week. Unmarked boxes, decoy displays, cameras angled down at hands, not heads. Officers learn a new beat, not who walks into the aisle, but who lingers after putting a bottle back. A detective writes 2 verbs on a Post-it and sticks it to his dashboard handle, hesitate. He will spend hours looking for both. 21. 20. The newsroom switches tone from breathless to careful. A senior producer kills a segment that points too aggressively at a likely suspect. The anchor uses a sentence that belongs to the few. A name is not a charge. In living rooms across the city, viewers learn the ethics of proximity. Hurt is not a license to guess. 22. 10. The extortion arrest hits wires. The man's name trends in the way names did. Before the word trending was invented, shouted crosstown, printed early, argued late. The press repeats the legal status like a drill arrested for the letter denies the murders. The public, relieved to have a face, briefly confuses arrest with resolution. Law enforcement does not. The murders remain officially unsolved. The whiteboard does not erase itself. Day 4, 07:30. Detectives sit with an empty map and start again. Walk the stores, not the story. In 2 locations, security managers remember a man who hovered without buying the kind of hover that reads as rehearsal. Descriptions are like reflections in rain, true in shape, slippery in detail. A sketch artist does what sketch artists do. She listens for the geometry that repeats across witnesses and draws a face that hoards ambiguity. The drawing goes to air. The tip line heat changes flavor. Every city has a dozen men who look like sketches. Chicago calls them all. 09, 05. The forensic accountants arrive at the table with their own kind of scent work. They run purchases against paychecks, leases against cash, chemistry supplies against the kind of bank activity that smells like hiding. They do not love marquee moments. They love quiet patterns. One rental locker pops up twice under different names, paid in cash, visited late. Officers open it with a warrant and professional dread. Inside, nothing but dust and the rectangular memory of something that leaned against a wall and left. 10:40. A false start turns into a cautionary tale. A man on the periphery of the case is named in bars and on blocks as the killer. He is not charged. He is harassed. Months later, rage and rumor meet in a parking lot. A bystander dies for standing in the wrong air. The documentary refuses to cast that man as chapter heading because pain is not a narrative device. It is a cost. The camera turns back to the board. The board keeps its nouns. 11:15. The FDA's cameras film the first production line to run with triple-sealed bottles. A worker taps each cap as if knocking on a door. The shot will become the image that says, "After." The voiceover does not celebrate. It concludes, design cannot catch a killer, but it can make the next attempt louder. Prevention is a kind of justice the courts don't measure. 1200. 48 hours since the first public warning. 72 hours since the first collapse. The death count has not climbed. The recall has reached the corners of the map. The man whose letter rattled the public will face a courtroom for extortion. The person who opened capsules and put death back under lights is either watching the news or not, either finished or waiting. Investigators learn to live with both possibilities because that is the work. 13:30. The task force briefs the press without theater. No grand pronouncements, no false confidence. We have narrowed behaviors. The commander says a sentence that sounds like nothing until you realize behavior is what you arrest before you have a name. He lists the anchors of their working theory, evening hours store selection, that suggests familiarity, not randomness, a comfort with resealing that looks like repetition. A reporter asks about motive. He says the two words that true crime hates because they end segments we don't know. 14:05. A legislator tours a pharmacy with cameras in tow and says the phrase that will become law inside a year, federal anti-tampering. It will not solve yesterday. It will change tomorrow. In the edit bay, a producer resists the urge to cut the clip beneath righteous music. The sound that belongs under it is quieter, a piece of tape peeling away a foil seal cracking with a promise it can finally keep. 15 Ozenred. The documentary's clock returns to the beginning, a home, a kitchen, a bottle. The narration repeats the order that carried through the country in a single sentence: do not take extra-strength Tylenol. Then it adds what the case has earned since inspect return, replace. Habits save lives. They are not dramatic, so the film lends them its drama. Cut to 20. The whiteboard is crowded and clean at the same time, many lines, few faces. A detective caps his marker and says what he will say to himself for years. Not solved does not mean not changed. In the Dutch room of medicine cabinets everywhere, the frames now hold something: bands, foil, glue. The verb that follows the case is not solved. It is altered. 17 Onuard. Part 4 begins when distance replaces urgency, when the brand fights its way back into carts, when the triple seal becomes so ordinary you forget life before it, when the case file gets heavier than a single desk can hold, and when a city finally able to swallow without fear learns how to live with a question that never leaves. Day 4 slides into day 5 without ceremony. Panic has a half-life, procedure does not. The recall keeps moving, pallets manifests forklifts, while the investigation trades adrenaline for endurance. Newsrooms dim their breaking banners and switch to explainer packages. Pharmacies look different now, empty rows where capsules used to live, tablet displays, pulled forward like stage hands covering an unexpected gap. 9:00 a.m. The corporate town hall becomes a roadshow. Engineers stand beside line drawings labeled triple seal shrink band, foil liner, glued carton, 3 small rings that promise a larger idea. If someone tampers, the package must fail loudly. In manufacturing plants, cap hoppers and induction sealers learn new choreography. A camera set above the line watches a transparent band hug a white cap, and for the first time, audiences at home feel relief as a design, not a statement. 10:15. Families bury their dead away from microphones. Reporters, some of them remember how to lower their voices. Eulogies reject headlines in favor of human detail, a laugh, a winter coat, the way a person signed their name. The documentary stays at the curb and lets the churches close their doors because not everything is for the camera, and not every detail belongs to the public ledger of fear. 11:40. The extortion case moves on its own calendar. The letter typed cold transactional has a name attached now, an arrest, and a court date. The newsroom repeats the sentence that keeps the story honest, convicted, in connection with the letter, not with the murders. Viewers at home repeat it too, some of them, because conflation is comforting and accuracy is hard. The detectives on the task force carry both truths at once. An extortionist can be guilty of extortion, and someone else can still be unfound. 1:00 p.m. The task force shrinks slightly at the edges and hardens at the center. The bottle grid lot numbers to stores to purchases has gaps that will never close. Security cameras from 1982 do not love faces. They barely love time. What remains is behavior. Evening hours. Familiarity with shelf rhythms. Confidence with resealing. A comfort inside fluorescent light that does not belong to most people. A lieutenant circles practice on the whiteboard as if muscle memory were a suspect. 14:20. Copycats arrive with the cruel predictability of thunder after lightning. Some scares prove false, some ugly jokes turn criminal, and some incidents in other cities are real enough to draw lab coats to new benches. The newly minted Federal Anti-Tampering Act begins its journey from idea to statute. It won't rename the past, it will redraw the future. The camera will linger later on a signature beneath the seal, because sometimes symbolism isn't a metaphor. It's law. 1500. Business schools begin drafting case studies in real time. The recall, swift, sweeping, costly, will be praised for decades as stewardship in crisis, a rare moment when math conceded to trust and the brand survived because it chose not to. Inside the company, the victory feels different. It sounds like new training for field reps and sales teams explaining shrink bands in bright aisles to people who only want to buy relief and go home. 1635. The newsroom turns to what changed packages. A producer points the camera at a trash can full of returned bottles images that register as safety, not waste. A pharmacist demonstrates how to read a foil dome, how a tamper band should tear with a dry little sound, like thin ice cracking. A reporter standing in front of a plant says the phrase that sticks design is prevention you can see. Evening. The city exhales in short breaths. Restaurants turn their televisions down. In some homes, capsules and other brands sit in cabinets like contraband legal, but no longer welcome. In others, people have already shifted to tablets, without thinking, the market learning faster than it can be taught. The ERs are calmer than the graphics would suggest, because advice got ahead of hysteria for once and stayed there. Day 6. The task force plays offense against entropy. Leads taper. Names ripen, then go soft. A retail employee remembers a man who hovered and folded a box corner the way nervous hands do. A neighbor swears a garage smelled chemical on a night no one can calendar. A chemistry hobbyist's workbench holds more curiosity than malice. Each line on the board wins an arrow or gets erased. The closest thing to momentum is refusal, the refusal to let a file become a memorial. 10:10 a.m. The lab shows its work. Opened bottles line a table like students on picture day. Some have seals lifted clean and reburnished. Others show haste foil-torn powder dusting the threads. Cotton wads carry fingerprints only in movies. In real life, cotton tells you roughly how a hand moved, not whose hand it was. A tech marks the tiniest nicks on plastic caps and speaks a sentence that is half science, half anthropology. This was done by someone who understood assembly, not just chemistry. Noon. Legislators tour pharmacies. Sound bites become policy proposals. Tamper-evident moves from design spec to mandate in a voice that makes manufacturing lines speed up without skipping steps. The public learns a new habit the way children learn playground rules by repetition until it feels obvious. Twist the band, check the foil, listen for the dry tear, throw it out if anything looks wrong. When in doubt, don't becomes public health doctrine. 14 Ohmzuer. In the newsroom, the anchor's tone shifts from breaking news to accounting. Not accounting for dollars, though those numbers are big, but for changes you can list and carry seals, labels, training law. The segment is less thrilling than a live shot outside an ER. It is more useful. What we learned becomes a recurring graphic no one expected to need. 16 Auxerre. The families become teachers. Some agree to speak on camera carefully to say their names to fix the dead in time as people who lived and laughed and had lists on the fridge. Their interviews give the documentary permission to slow down without softening. The narrator refuses to narrate over tears. Silence takes the floor because grief is its own narrator when you let it be. Day 7. The brand returns to shelves in a new body tablet first capsule, later triple-sealed everything. Television ads play a tune you can't hum but can believe we changed so you can trust us. In focus groups, people twist bands absently while they talk about weather and bills and the way the world suddenly feels engineered for safety. The market share graph will be shown in classrooms as proof that doing the right thing can sometimes also be the winning thing. Week 2. The case file gets heavier, the press coverage gets thinner. Investigators learn what long work sounds like, the whir of lab equipment, the squeak of marker on whiteboard, the patience of dialing a number a fourth time and asking a question in a new way. The documentary refuses the cheap cut to, and then nothing. Instead, it shows how nothing is made of 1,000 small somethings that don't cohere until one day, maybe they do. Month 3. The anti-tampering statute is law. Prosecutors have a new charge to bring, and in the years ahead they will. A separate case far from Chicago will end with a conviction for a poisoner who thought random could be cover. The law will disagree. The Tylenol murders won't receive their courtroom, but they will change courtrooms just the same. That is not closure. It is consequence. Year 1. The newsroom returns on the anniversary with a piece that resists the impulse to reignite fear. It counts changes instead of bodies. It thanks pharmacists and lab techs by name. It interviews a packaging engineer whose spreadsheet probably saved more lives than any speech. The anchor ends with a sentence that owes its cadence to prayer. May we never need to say these warnings again, and may we never forget how to hear them. Between anniversaries, myths proliferate. A viewer tells a neighbor the case was solved. It wasn't. A forum lists suspects as if listing were proof. It isn't. A documentary somewhere picks a villain and calls it storytelling. The film you're watching declines that bargain. It keeps the nouns where they belong, extortion letter charged and adjudicated. Murders officially unsolved. Design changed. Law updated. Trust repaired, not restored, because restored implies a return to a past that never existed. The past had foil you could peel quietly. The future has bands that shout. Night. The city has new rituals now. In kitchens, people twist seals without thinking, a tiny ceremony of risk, acknowledged and dismissed. In pharmacies, techs face the analgesics aisle with fresh eyes and a reflex that survived the news cycle. In labs, a vial marked control sits next to a vial marked unknown, and young toxicologists learn to smell bitter almond the way their teachers did as memory, not drama. What remains unsatisfying is what remains true. The person who opened capsules, added poison, and put death back on a shelf has never been marched into a courtroom to answer a charge that fits. Some investigators believe they know the shape of the author, even if they never saw the signature. Others believe the case will stay a lesson, not a verdict. The documentary doesn't pretend to arbitrate. It places the camera in a quiet pharmacy aisle at closing and lets the hum of the lights tell you what changed. Safety is no longer assumed. It is manufactured, inspected, and believed only after it announces itself out loud. Before the credits, the newsroom clock appears one more time, not counting down, but counting out 72:00 to 00:00, then back up again, a metronome for ordinary life. The narrator borrows a sentence from a pharmacist interviewed on day 10, a sentence that sounds simple, until you feel how hard it was earned. Check the seal, then take a breath. History class doesn't always have a chalkboard. Sometimes it has a pharmacy aisle, a foil dome, and a habit you perform without thinking. The Tylenol murders move from breaking news to civic muscle memory, the way most permanent changes do, quietly by repetition until the world can't remember itself any other way. 8:00 a.m. In a health sciences lecture hall, a toxicologist holds up two bottles, one from before, one from after. She doesn't need to say which is which. The class knows the straight-cut cap with no band, the naked mouth under a lid, the carton that opens like a paperback. Then the newcomer, a clear shrink ring clinging to the cap, a foil seal that answers with a crisp tear, a carton glued shut like an oath. Design is prevention. You can see, she says, borrowing a line the news once taught the country. And prevention is policy you can trust. 10:15. A police academy classroom plays the old footage live trucks outside ER doors, maps blooming red, a press conference where the word tampering moved from jargon to public lexicon. The instructor doesn't linger on drama. He talks lanes, local detectives, on behaviors, federal partners, on statutes, labs, on chemistry, corporate teams, on distribution. A recruit asks the obvious, uncomfortable question, what if the person stops? What if the noise drowns the signal? The instructor draws two boxes on the board, law and design, and writes the answer in the middle, resilience. You can't force a confession into existence. You can force the next attempt to squeal. Noon. A packaging engineer opens a brown envelope full of old sketches. In pencil, it reads, triple seal. There is nothing glamorous about the drawings, just rings, adhesives, tolerances, heat profiles. But somewhere between graphite and glue, an industry reset itself. She walks a crew through a modern line caps fed into a hopper, bands heated into grip induction coils, fusing foil to bottle mouths with a hum that sounds like caution turned into music. A camera close-ups the foil's micro-emboss. We learn to make silence suspicious, the engineer says. If a package doesn't announce itself honest, you don't accept it. 13:40. The newsroom that once ran wall-to-wall panic now builds service journalism. A segment titled Check the Seal plays between weather and sports. The anchor twists, a band lifts a foil and narrates verbs inspect, listen, compare. In millions of kitchens, the choreography becomes second nature. The show doesn't say, remember 1982. It doesn't have to. Memory has found a home in plastic. 14:30. In a corporate conference room, crisis comms slides use the case as a preface, not a postscript. A bullet point no longer negotiable. Move fast, say more own the risk. Another replace. Before asked, the recall that once stunned analysts is now a line item in leadership training trust, over short-term math transparency, over lawyers reflex a camera at the plant, rather than a statement at a podium. A young manager asks what happens if the public still doesn't forgive. The executive gives the only honest answer, you do the right thing anyway, and you keep doing it. 1605. Legislators in committee rooms quote a statute that didn't exist when the first bottles were pulled. The anti-tampering law is now case law jury instruction and deterrent. Prosecutors on other cases elsewhere later will test its teeth and find them sharp. The class learns two words that look alike and act different: tamper-resistant and tamper-evident. One reduces opportunity, the other raises volume. The law can't stop every hand. It can make consequences clearer and proofs easier. Evening. Families of the victims choose their own kind of permanence, scholarships, community talks, interviews sparingly given and carefully framed. When they do speak, they do not recite headlines. They say names and small human facts, and the warning we built this culture to hear: check before you trust. The documentary never narrates over those sentences. It lets them sit in the room with the weight they carry. Week 2. The investigation becomes two parallel trails: the cold, which you work with discipline, and the hot, which you hold space for when it surprises you. The cold trail is evidence interviews revisited with different eyes behaviors rather than namings. The hot trail is every credible scare that echoes the method: a bottle that tastes wrong, a seal that looks off a clerk who notices hesitation. Most scares turn out to be fear wearing somebody else's coat. A few produce charges under a law born from a Chicago week the city can now describe by minute. Month 6. A young reporter corners a retired detective for the anniversary package and asks whether the case is solvable. He doesn't say no. He refuses to perform optimism. We solved the future, he says, which is a line easy to dismiss until you stand in an aisle and hear a ring crack clean under your fingers. He lists what he would teach: follow distribution like a city map, respect the lab's vocabulary, be kind to the worried well-phrased warnings so they become rituals, and never barter certainty you don't own. Year 1. The brand returns not with bravado, but with routine coupons, instructionals, pharmacists as ambassadors. Focus groups twist new bands absent-mindedly while talking about grocery lists. Market share graphs do a thing MBA students like to point at: in case studies they dip, then rise and settle. A skeptical viewer at home thinks, so they recovered. The documentary's answer is narrower and less soothing. Trust didn't bounce back. It was rebuilt. That distinction matters because it tells you who did the work: engineers, line workers, clerks, techs, people who turned sealed into an audible verb. Year 2. The case file shifts bookcases and floors. New detectives inherit it. The binder tabs have been replaced 3 times. The extortion conviction tied to the letter sits in its own volume, not chapter 1, not chapter last, but a parallel thread the law has already tied off. Press rumor cycles try every few years to assign an ending to the story. The film doesn't. It keeps the noun's careful extortion adjudicated, murders officially unsolved. A future scare arrives in another city, another decade. The newsroom refuses to use the earlier case as gasoline. It uses it as instruction. Anchors default to verbs, not villains: inspect, stop, report. Prosecutors reach for the statute that exists because a city once learned the hard way. Packaging lines in plants that never heard a Chicago scanner in 1982 implement the same choreography as if it were part of the national grid. A classroom exercise: take any consumer act and find the safety ritual attached. Food date codes, fuel pump card readers, airline boarding doors that chirp wrong when the right document is wrong. Each ritual had a week like this somewhere behind it. The lesson isn't paranoia, it's literacy. Night. The documentary returns to a quiet pharmacy after closing. Curved mirrors stare into aisles. Caps and bands line shelves like a choir assembled by tooling and policy. A clerk wipes a counter no one will see and checks a shelf no one will touch until morning. The camera lingers on a box flap, glued with more determination than a generation ago. The narrator's voice drops and trades drama for cadence. A week taught this aisle to speak. The CODA. You expect a suspect, a confession doesn't come. What comes is a smaller, truer ending, a public that learned to hear packaging, an industry that learned to over-communicate risk, a law that learned to treat tampering like the felony it is, and an investigation that learned to live with a question without letting go of the work. That's not closure. It's consequence, and sometimes consequence is the only honest gift a story can give. Epilogue beats arrive like the steady tick of a closed caption line. A pharmacist training a new hire twists the band, check the foil, feel the cap threads. If anything resists, you resist harder. A manufacturing supervisor tapping a bar graph while a conveyor hums fewer defects, louder failures. A health teacher showing a clip from the week and asking a room full of teenagers why warnings sound the way they do. A family choosing to keep and to use a medicine cabinet again. If your mind still wants a villain, remember the film's promise from the outset: we would privilege accuracy over catharsis. A name exists in the extortion file. A conviction exists for that act alone. The murders officially are unsolved. The most faithful way to honor the dead is to stand in the aisle we rebuilt and perform the ritual we learned for them. The last shot is not a face. It is a hand. It reaches into frame, lifts a bottle, turns, it finds the band, and listens for the small, bright sound of a promise kept. Then it sets the bottle down and walks away, because not taking is also a choice the week taught us. Roll credits over a clock that no longer counts down. It counts forward second by second in the ordinary rooms where this story planted a guardrail and left it behind. History doesn't end with a press conference. It echoes in aisles, in labs, in the way a hand twists plastic before it trusts a pill. The Tylenol Murders moved from scream to system inside a week, but the sound they left behind kept dictating decisions for years. This is the long tail, the part of the story that doesn't make sirens, only habits. Morning in a different city, a different year. A clerk faces the analgesics aisle with a new reflex. Eyes, first hands, second. Caps line up like soldiers who've learned a song, band, foil, glue, repeat. When a seal looks wrong, she doesn't debate herself. She pulls the bottle, logs the lot, and calls it in. The manager doesn't ask whether she's sure. The word tampering did something to retail culture that no training manual alone could have done it, gave skepticism a badge. In a police classroom, recruits watch a slice of 1982 unfold on a CRT monitor, rolled in on a cart that deserves a museum label. They listen to the language change product contamination to tampering recall to swap warning to ritual. The instructor doesn't sell them an ending. He sells them a posture. If the offender stops, he says you have 2 jobs: guard the public and keep the file alive. He writes a list on the whiteboard, not suspects, but behaviors, evening aisles, practiced reseals, comfort with fluorescent light, familiarity with store rhythms. People are not patterns, he adds, but patterns are how you survive unsolved. Newsrooms that once ran wall-to-wall fear now build explainers that teach. A producer cuts a 2-minute segment called How to Hear Packaging. On camera, an anchor holds a bottle and narrates the choreography twist. The band listen. Lift the foil look. Feel the threads decide. It's not thrilling, it's service. And service is what sticks. Viewers copy the motions in living rooms with the same half-attention they give to tying shoes, learned then automatic. The investigation grows quieter as it grows older. Detectives rotate. The file changes desks, but not weight. Leads thin, then arrive in jolts. A chemist who never stops thinking about cyanide builds better tests, not because a courtroom will need them this week, but because some future courtroom might. A packaging engineer who once sketched triple seal becomes an evangelist for failure that screams, if someone tampers, the package should betray them at a glance. In plant tours, she knocks a cap and says, "We learned to make silence suspicious." Copycats exist because attention does. After 1982, scares pop up in other zip codes, other brands, other aisles. Many are hoaxes, panic with props. Some are crimes that meet the law now built to catch them. Prosecutors open the federal anti-tampering toolkit and discover its teeth were sharpened by that Chicago week. Courts learn to speak about packaging as evidence intent as a tool randomness as a weapon. The statute doesn't rename the past. It makes a future case legible. The extortion letter gets its own arc. Investigators follow its paper and typewriter scars to a name. A man is arrested and later convicted of extortion tied to the letter punished for leverage, not for murder. News anchors repeat the legally precise sentence until it loses its novelty and gains its moral connection, is not guilt. Years later, when his obituary appears, headlines revisit the week and inevitably blur edges the law kept sharp. The documentary you're watching keeps reciting the line that cleaves truth from relief. The murders remain officially unsolved. At intervals measured in years, the case warms. A new technology promises a new door, re-examined prints, trace DNA from packaging analytics that ring signal from inventories that once looked like noise. Search warrants light up a map, apartments, lockers, a home, 2 states away. Teams roll in. Quietly take computers, swab for DNA bag notebooks, whose margins carry the kind of doodles detectives love and juries never see. The press camps outside and viewers at home rehearse a familiar mistake. Arrest equals ending until the evening news corrects them. No charges. The board remains nouns, not names. If you need a villain to sleep, this isn't that film. What it offers instead is an index of consequences. Pharmacies redesign camera grids to tilt down at hands, not faces. Registers flag analgesic returns for manager review. Store plans pull the pain aisle under brighter light and closer to staffed counters. Manufacturers adopt capsule banding, then favor tablets and caplets that resist being opened and reclosed without confession. Induction sealers hum on lines that would have looked like science fiction to a 1982 plant manager. And consumers, millions of them, build a tiny ritual into their mornings, twist, listen, look. There's a scene documentaries love for a reason. It happens in a lab where the air smells like isopropyl and diligence. A young tech holds a vial in one gloved hand and a pipette in the other, narrating a process that would bore a thriller and save a life. She didn't live the week the film keeps recounting. She doesn't need to. Its curriculum lives in her job description controls, unknowns, cross-contamination safeguards, results written in language that doesn't care about television. Absence of evidence, she says, isn't evidence of absence. It's instruction to keep looking in the right places. Another scene quieter. A family kitchen decades on. A parent opens a medicine cabinet without flinching because culture and plastic and law and people who stayed late at plants have earned back the seconds the week once stole. The hand reaches, pauses, twists. The sound the band makes is tiny, bright, almost cheerful. The camera doesn't push in. It gives the moment privacy. Sometimes victory is just an ordinary morning working again. True crime lovers want motive delivered like a headline. Investigators will tell you why that's a myth that keeps cases unsolved. Randomness is a strategy when the weapon is trust. It disrupts narrative, confounds neighborhood rumor, resists the profile a jury wants by lunch. In interviews, veterans of the task force choose accuracy over catharsis. We prefer answers, one says. We work with evidence. It isn't satisfying. It is honest, and honesty is the only currency that spends after an unsolved case ages. Journalists learn too. The week taught anchors to speak like public health officers when rumor outruns fact, to show how before they show who to keep likely suspect out of prompters until the charge sheet agrees. In editorial meetings, producers kill segments that lean on confident maybes. The film includes those choices because ethics is part of the long tail. It's the difference between a community informed and a community inflamed. Lawmakers for once followed a headline with statute instead of only speeches. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act becomes a through line in criminal justice textbooks, an example of Congress hitting the right nail with the right hammer at the right height. Later cases elsewhere unconnected prove the law's reach. Juries now have instructions made for this crime not borrowed from others. Defense attorneys adjust, prosecutors learn restraint, judges learn the vocabulary of safety seals. What about the brand that stood under the brightest lights? Business schools canonize the recall as case study. The short version is easy. They pulled everything fast, spoke plainly, took the hit, and lived. The long version matters more. They elevated pharmacists to ambassadors, took engineers on television, taught consumers exactly how to check what they were buying, and rebuilt trust as a boring habit, not a press release. The graph that dipped and rose lives on in slide decks. The habit lives in your hands. Eventually, every big story becomes smaller stories. You can't see an extra camera above an aisle, a code in a register, a training slide in a back room, a clause in a contract, a sentence in a statute, a reflex in a kitchen. That's the end this film believes in. Not solved, not named, but operationalized pain turned into procedure that keeps strangers safe long after the credits. Night again, any city. A pharmacy manager does her last walk. The analgesics aisle is clean. The mirrors hold their fisheye silence. She stops not because she doubts, but because pausing is part of the job now. She runs a finger along a shelf edge. Dust tells its own small truths, then checks a facing that sits too perfect. Satisfied, she kills the row of fluorescents, leaving one lamp on over the counter like a lighthouse that doesn't need to be dramatic to work. The documentary could end here. Ordinary lights, ordinary work, ordinary safety. It doesn't. It plays one last piece of tape, a newsroom clock from 1982, counting down from 7200 to 0000, then vanishing. Over it, a voice you've come to trust says the only line that makes sense, of a case that changed everything and solved nothing. Check the seal. Then take a breath. If you stayed for the echoes, you understand the promise. The next time a headline tries to borrow fear from this week, you'll remember the choreography, not the panic. Twist, listen, look. Refuse a package that doesn't confess. Call when doubt knocks. And believe not in certainty, but in systems built by people who refuse to let a crime define the aisle it used to haunt. Big cases don't just leave evidence. They leave stories, some careful, some convenient. By the time the Tylenol murders moved from sirens to statutes, a second investigation had begun in living rooms and comment sections, people trying to make a week of terror tidy. This part isn't about reliving panic. It's about separating the myths that keep us anxious from the facts that keep us safe. Mourning a decade later, a college seminar titled Crisis, Media, and Trust screens. The familiar montage ambulance lights pulled products press conferences. A student raises a hand with the first myth the company knew earlier than they said and waited. The professor doesn't argue feelings. She puts up a timeline. First collapse, first lab confirmation, first coordinated warning, first recall order hours, not weeks. She points to what matters in crisis ethics, speed, clarity, and the choice to talk before certainty is perfect. You can audit a clock, she says. Conjecture not so much. Another hand, weren't tablets poisoned too? The seminar rewinds to chemistry. The labs found cyanide in capsules, not tablets. Capsules open except a contaminant and close again in a way tablets do not. That difference drove the triple seal redesign and the temporary market tilt toward tablets and caplets. It also changed language, tamper-resistant harder to open and tamper-evident louder when opened. Policy lives in prepositions. In a newsroom archive, a producer labels a bin myths we've already corrected. The stack is thick. A favorite. It spread nationwide before the recall. Maps say otherwise clustered bottles, Chicago area, shelf-level interference. National fear, yes. National poisoning, no. Another. There was a confession. There wasn't. Another. The extortion arrest closed the case. It didn't. He was convicted of extortion tied to the letter, not the murders. The film keeps repeating that sentence because repetition is how truth competes with appetite. So what do we actually know in language that will hold up in a courtroom and a classroom? We know cyanide killed quickly. Chemistry. Nobody negotiated. We know multiple victims took capsules from consumer bottles. We know the pattern matched shelf-level tampering in a single metro area. We know the recall was sweeping and fast, the communications blunt, and the redesign of packaging aggressive enough to teach the public a new reflex. We know an extortion letter existed, was traced, and resulted in a conviction for extortion and nothing further. We know copycats and hoaxes appeared, some charged under the new law, and we know the murders themselves remain officially unsolved. Why unsolved? The answer is boring, which is to say, accurate. 1982 didn't have what 2025 takes for granted: ubiquitous video digital point-of-sale footprints, DNA workflows on plastic threads, package integrity sensors that scream when a seal is broken. Shelf-level tampering is both low-tech and high deniability. It uses public space, ordinary objects, and minutes that pass unnoticed. The crime's cruelty is its randomness. The investigation's challenge is the same. A detective who carried the file for years explains it at a podium to rookies who want a villain to practice on. Some crimes are built for court, he says. This one was built for culture. He means the part, after the chase seals and bans policies and laws, a new way to look at a cap before you twist. He doesn't fold the file closed. He refuses to pretend consequence equals closure. Meanwhile, in media land, we have our own reckoning. The week taught newsrooms to treat public health messaging as a beat, not an interruption, demonstrate the seal, show the foil, center verbs over villains when facts are still walking to the microphone. The old temptation, fill silence with personality, was expensive in 1982 and is catastrophic now. Editors who came up through that week still kill likely suspect scripts that outpace charge sheets. Producers still put service how-tos between weather and sports. It's not glamorous. It's useful. Useful is the point. Corporate crisis playbooks changed, too. It's fashionable to call the recall a PR masterstroke. It was something less cynical and more durable stewardship. Pull everything fast, tell people exactly what to do, show them the factory, and make the package itself. A teacher says, a retired executive, who still keeps a shrink band in her desk, like a talisman. Business schools love the market share graph that dips and rises. She prefers a quieter one-complaint volume versus clear packaging. We won back trust one tiny crack sound at a time, she says, not with a slogan. Legally, the case functioned like a lever. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act gave prosecutors a statute that matched the behavior. Later courtrooms, different brands, different cities would lean on it to punish threats that never escalated to murder and those rare horrors that did. The Tylenol file didn't give the law a defendant. It gave it a vocabulary and penalties. Statutes don't heal. They prevent. Prevention is the only justice that can work before someone is harmed. If this part is about literacy, you deserve heuristics you can use tomorrow. 1. Inspect the ring and the foil every time, even when you're tired. 2. Hesitation in the aisle is fine, embarrassment is cheap. 3. Report what doesn't feel right. You are not bothering anyone. Systems depend on eyes. 4. Distrust tidy narratives offered late. Solved without a charge is entertainment, not adjudication. 5. Distinguish extortion tied to a case from guilt for the case. The law does. A quieter truth sits behind the headlines and habits. Grief becomes governance. Families who chose microphones did so sparingly, carefully, and often with a single ask, keep learning the ritual. Their restraint is part of why the film doesn't name villains that prosecutors didn't. It honors the line between wanting and knowing. Wanting makes good television. Knowing makes good law. There's a scene we held until now because it deserves a room that's calmed down. A packaging engineer stands over a running line and watches seals seat themselves with the confidence of a routine that's paid its tuition. She taps one, then another, and hears the same tiny answer the public has learned to love. Design, she says, is a language. Ours now says, prove you're safe before the customer swallows. A journalist nearby writes it down in a notebook that still smells like a printer from the 80s and thinks, if we're lucky, this is the last time most people ever hear this story and the first time they perform it. Myth correction isn't a scold, it's maintenance. In a world that rewards, hot takes the case asks for cool hands. The film offers a compact you can steal for your own life. Prefer clocks to rumors, procedures to personalities, verbs to villains, and when in doubt, throw the bottle away and buy a new one. The price of caution is pocket change. The price of assuming is higher than a headline can print. By now you've noticed we didn't stage a last-minute twist. That's on purpose. The twist that matters already happened. A culture that thought safety was silent learned to demand noise. Triple seals, shrink bands, foil that confesses if touched, clerks who act on hunches, laws that call a tamperer what they are, investigations that can say unsolved without saying undone. Near midnight, the film returns to a single frame, a kitchen, a hand, a cap. The ring breaks with that bright domestic click that means someone you love can stop hurting. No dramatics, just a mechanism working a habit, holding a week's worst lesson quietly earning out. If you came here for catharsis, we hope consequence will do. Part 8 begins with a choice about form. We can end with a CODA that speaks to the families and the investigators, or we can build a short viewer's guide to future scares, how to read announcements, how to audit your own cabinet, how to talk to children about safety without recruiting fear. Either way, the last line won't change. Check the seal, then take a breath. The film earned the right to slow down. After sirens, recalls, and a manhunt that became a map of behaviors rather than a portrait, the story narrows to a room, a kitchen at 7:12 a.m., quiet except for a kettle and a habit. The cabinet opens, a hand reaches, a cap turns. This is where the case lives now, not in headlines, but in reflex. If the earlier chapters taught what happened, this one teaches what to do. It's a CODA for families who lost, for investigators who carried, and for anyone who will ever stand in front of a shelf and make a choice. Start with the only promise a documentary should make. There is a way to be cautious without recruiting fear. You don't need a bunker. You need literacy eyes that know what safety looks like, ears that know what honesty sounds like. The language is simple, and it was written in plastic and law. Rule 1. The rule beneath the rules slow down by a second. Safety is a beat, not a speech. One extra inhale between reaching and swallowing resets the whole scene. During that second look for the trilogy, the week gave you band foil glue, the shrink ring clinging to the cap, the foiled dome seated flat and tight, the carton flap glued, not merely folded. No drama, just inspection. Twisting the band should yield a small crisp, give like breaking thin ice with 2 fingers. Lifting the foil should feel bonded, not casual. It should resist before it surrenders. A flap that opens without a tear is a flap to question. Rule 2. Trust your hesitation. Doubt is not paranoia. It is a public health tool. If the band is split, if the foil is loose, if the cap feels like it's been on and off and back again, say no. Put it down. Exchange it. Ask the pharmacist. Embarrassment is cheap. Replacement is cheaper. The price of ignoring your own nudge is the kind of price this film was made to prevent. Rule 3. Report what you refuse. Clerks and pharmacists are not extras in this story. They are the front line. A quick description, brand form, lot code store time travels faster than rumor and does more good. Systems are designed to listen now. The weak built those channels. When in doubt, you are not bothering anyone. You are completing a circuit the culture spent decades wiring. Rule 4. Keep categories straight. Capsules versus tablets is not trivia. Capsules can be opened and reclosed. Tablets cannot be unbaked. That is why the market leaned toward solid forms and why capsules now wear armor. Tamper-resistant, harder to open is engineering. Tamper-evident, louder if opened is choreography. Both matter. The first frustrates hands, the second alerts eyes. Together, they give your second of inspection something to grab. Rule 5. Choose clocks over rumors. When a scare lands on your phone, look for timestamps and sources. Is it a press office, a health department, a store notice with lot numbers, or is it a screenshot with adjectives? Clocks are verifiable. Adjectives are portable. In a world that can make fear contagious in minutes, the cure is chronology. Parents ask for a version of the ritual they can teach without scaring the house quiet. The answer is to make it domestic. Let a child hear the ring break like they hear a seatbelt click. Make the sound a signal of ordinary safety, not an alarm. Show them that asking a grown-up for help with a package isn't tattling, it's teamwork. Children absorb posture faster than they absorb facts. Give them a posture that looks like care, not like panic. Investigators who live the week request a different CODA. A public that remembers relief can be engineered. Prevention is not the absence of danger. It is the presence of design training audit trails and 1,000 daily acts of attention from people whose names will never show up in a script. The anti-tampering statute hangs on courtroom walls. The triple seal hums on production lines. The retail grid is brighter and closer to staffed counters. Cameras tilt at hands now, not just faces. These are not plot points. They are culture points, boring by design and effective by necessity. The myth segment returns for one last sweep, not to scold, but to seal. No, there wasn't a hidden confession that reporters buried. No, someone was arrested for the murders is not a sentence. History owes you an extortion conviction tied to a letter happened. A murder conviction did not. No unsolved does not mean nothing changed. It means the nouns that mattered moved from headlines to habits where they belong if you want tomorrow to be safer than yesterday. The camera drops into a pharmacy after close, where the only sound is ballast humming and the wheels of a mop bucket. A manager does the last walk eye line down the analgesics aisle, fingers on shelf edges because dust can rat out a misplaced box, a glance at the mirror that sees more than any one person can. It's not paranoia, it's procedure. Procedure is a kind of love when it protects strangers you'll never meet. Now the film owes the families something. It cannot pay the sentence that returns what was taken. It can't. What it can do is say their names as names, not as emblems, and leave space around each one, so the audience hears that there were birthdays and receipts on refrigerators, and winter coats still in closets when the week began. Grief is not a plot device. It's a boundary. The documentary steps to that boundary and doesn't cross. The investigators get a paragraph too. Not the TV version with a pinboard wall turning into applause. The real one over time logged tips, triaged leads that rot and leads that bloom patients treated like evidence, because without it, evidence never arrives. When they say we solved, the future believe them. The packaging on your shelf, the policy at your store, the statute in your code book, that's their work winning. It isn't courtroom applause. It's quieter and in the long run, louder. For the newsroom, the CODA is a memo we wish had been written decades earlier and is now taped to the edge of every newscast rundown when a product scare hits center instructions, not suspects. Show the seal. Repeat the verbs. Map the recall. Name the law. Keep words like likely chained to documents. Retire the coyness that turns fear into engagement. The algorithm will recover. A community misled won't. So here is your viewer's guide, not as a list for a refrigerator, but as a choreography. Any kitchen can learn. Inspect band intact, foil bonded carton glued. Listen, the ring should crack cleanly. The foil should resist before it yields. Compare. If a package looks different from the last one you opened, pause. Designs change, but caution stays. Refuse. Put it down if anything feels off. Replacement is easier than regret. Report. Tell the pharmacist or clerk. Give brand lot time store. Be the eyes the system expects. Reset. Teach the sound to your house. Make children hear the click as normal as a seatbelt. Some viewers will still want the last-minute twist, the face, the motive, the courtroom. The film answers with the truth this genre rarely offers because it's hard to market the ending that matters already happened. A culture learned to demand noise from safety. A law learned to call a saboteur by the right name. A company learned to put engineers on camera and show the factory, not the foyer. A city learned to live without a name and still insist on a ritual. If there's one sentence to take with you, let it be this repeated, the way warnings are repeated until they become manners. Check the seal, then take a breath. Not because the world is worse than you feared, but because a week in 1982 taught us a way to make it better. One bright, domestic click at a time. When the credits roll, the clock that once counted down from 72 doesn't reappear. You've met it already. In the time it takes a ring to break and a foil to lift, the story completes itself and starts again in every kitchen, every pharmacy, every quiet room where ordinary life depends on design and design answers back. There's a kind of ending that never trends. It doesn't have a perp walk, a podium, or a gavel landing like thunder. It sounds like plastic conceding to your fingers, a dry little crack as a ring gives way a foil that resists before it yields. The week that terrified a city and taught a country to listen leaves us here inside a kitchen that looks like every kitchen with a ceremony so small you could miss it if you didn't know what you were hearing. The documentary has walked you through siren statements, a recall measured in forklifts, and a hunt that chose behavior over bravado. It has insisted on sentences that resist easy applause, convicted of extortion tied to the letter. The murders remain officially unsolved. It has traded villains for verbs, inspect refuse report, and retold a story that changed millions of mornings without giving one family the closure they deserved. If the credits rolled now, you could argue we stopped short. We didn't. We stopped where the case actually lives, because this ending is an ecosystem, not a reveal. Start with design. A line worker on a third-shift packaging floor taps a cap as it lands, listens for the right thrum, and rejects the odd note without needing a supervisor's nod. The induction sealer hums like a choir. You didn't know a machine could sing heat-bonding foil to a bottle mouth with a precision born of fear and of respect. The shrink band slides into place and clings the way a seatbelt clicks. It is not there to be admired. It is there to announce itself honest loudly to a stranger who will never learn the name of the person who made it so. Move to retail. A clerk, first job, light jacket name tag, still stiff faces the analgesics aisle with more confidence than she had last week because she has permission to doubt. When something looks off, she doesn't ask herself whether she's being dramatic. She asks for a manager, logs the lot, bags the bottle, and makes a call the system expects her to make. In the back office, the form she fills isn't bureaucracy. It's infrastructure. A map you'll never see gets a new dot. An investigator you'll never meet gets a new place to look if looking becomes necessary again. Then the lab. A young toxicologist labels 2 tubes that will never make B-roll control and unknown. She runs the assay logs, the run, and signs her name under a number because numbering is how truth survives cross-examination and time. The week the film keeps returning to is older than her. She treats it like a teacher she won't ever meet. Her narration is impersonal on purpose. The sentences that stand up in court rarely sparkle. They hold. Law sits beside them, quiet and ready. The statute that did not exist on day 1 now exists everywhere, printed in pocket guides, summarized in charging memos, refined by case law that followed. Prosecutors in other cities have used it to call a threat a crime before a body becomes a press conference. Defense attorneys have poked its edges. Judges have learned to instruct juries on the difference between tamper-resistant and tamper-evident without turning a closing argument into a product demo. This, too, is an ending, the kind that equips rooms you will never enter with words that do their job. What about the newsroom, the instrument that can dial a community toward caution or toward chaos? The long tail of the week remade its reflexes. When a scare flickers, now anchors reach for clocks, not adjectives. They show quickly what to inspect and where to find lot codes. They map recalls with dates and counties and phone numbers that ring. The piece that would have been a sizzle reel becomes a service segment. The producer who kills the reckless Chiron doesn't get applause. She gets another shift. In journalism worth having, that's what a win looks like. Families live in a different grammar altogether. Their interviews, if they choose them at all, are precise and generous without being performative. They say the names, not the headlines. They give you a laugh, a habit, a winter jacket left hanging by a door in late September. They let silence carry more than a soundtrack could. They accept the documentary's promise that accuracy outranks catharsis. And in return, the film refuses the oldest trick its genre knows, inventing an ending because the audience wants one. Wanting isn't knowing. Grief is not debt to be paid with narrative. Investigators, too, deserve a last paragraph that doesn't flatter or scold. The file didn't beat them, physics did. Shelf-level tampering is a crime of minutes, and public light an act that hides inside the ordinary until the ordinary turns lethal. In 1982, cameras were bad historians, cash registers forgot, and packaging assumed silence was safety. The best detectives can do after a week like that is build a world where the next attempt is loud. They did. The rest is vigilance and a kind of faith that sounds unromantic until you need it, that systems work when people who will never get thanked do their jobs well. You might still ask for motive. You deserve to. Sometimes there is none you can place in a script without lying to it. Randomness is its own strategy, a way to weaponize trust, a way to make the profile collapse. The film has denied you the dopamine that comes from a suspect, against a lens, because a different chemical matters more, the calm that returns when the world explains itself again, even if it cannot explain that one person. Calm, not certainty, is what lets a community carry on without forgetting the lesson it paid for. So here at the end is the only thesis we can defend with a straight spine. Safety is not a mood or a press release or a story you tell yourself about good neighborhoods and familiar brands. Safety is a system of law that bites of packages, that confess of workers, who notice of citizens, who report of journalists, who center verbs over villains, while facts are still arriving, of teachers who make children hear the click and call it normal. The murderer who never stood in a courtroom still lost something, the ability to do it that way again, without the aisle shouting at the next set of hands. If you came to this genre for the twist, consider this one. The happy ending was never going to be a door kicked in. It was always going to be a ring twisted off, a foil that said audibly, "Yes, I am new." A clerk who vetoed a hunch and was right. A line worker who rejected a cap because the thrum was wrong. A lab tech who wrote a number that stopped a rumor. A prosecutor who charged the crime you can prove and said out loud the one you can't. A newsroom that chose clocks over adjectives until the panic burned off and the habit remained. The camera returns to the same kitchen we started with, not because we ran out of locations, but because this one is the point. Morning light on a countertop, a hand on a bottle, the small pause we've been training all film to respect. The ring cracks, the foil lifts. The person you love takes a breath, then a tablet, then their day. Nothing about that moment is cinematic. Everything about it is earned. We owe you, before we go, the integrity of saying what we did not do. We did not assign guilt beyond the record. We did not rename an extortion conviction to make an ending. We did not turn families into devices. We built a map of the systems that rose up after a week that should never have been possible, and we asked you to keep one ritual alive: check the seal, then breathe. If you want to honor the names we kept sacred, that is how. The credits will list the usual producers, editors, researchers, fact-checkers. Imagine alongside them the uncredited role that kept you safe while you watched the worker who tapped a cap, the pharmacist who pulled a bottle, the inspector who followed an envelope, the detective who erased and redrew the same arrow 50 times, the legislator who found language that fit the crime, the educator who turned a horror into a habit, the anchor who killed a reckless script, the family who let this film borrow their quiet. When the last card fades, don't wait for a stinger. You're sitting in it. The next time your hand reaches for relief, give the ritual the second it asks for. Twist. Listen. Look. Refuse what doesn't confess. Report what does. Then take your medicine. Take your breath. And take with you the only ending this story can honestly promise: a world incrementally louder where it needs to be, and incrementally safer because of it. End credits. Then, light then, a kitchen, then the small, bright click of a promise kept. An ending that leaves the file open isn't a failure. It's a promise the system makes to the next hour. Long after the live trucks packed up and the recall became a business school chart, the Tylenol case settled into the quiet infrastructure of safety, the places where culture hides its best work. This postscript isn't a victory lap. It's a map of the rooms that keep the lesson alive. Morning training day. A police auditorium lowers the house lights and brings up a slide that isn't a suspect board but a syllabus design. Law, retail, lab, media, public. The instructor walks the row like a coach before a long season. You won't get a confession because you deserve one, he says. You'll get one if the world you build makes repetition impossible. On screen, a loop shows the ring breaking the foil, lifting the cap, turning with a clean, mechanical honesty. Recruits take notes on verbs, not names. In a different building, the FDA's classroom has its own choreography. A compliance officer sets 3 bottles on the table before after counterfeit and lets the room choose. They guess wrong because counterfeits have learned to imitate confidence. Then the officer teaches what the weak taught the country: don't audit the logo. Audit the failure mode. Real packaging tells on itself when touched. Fakes try to fail elegantly. Enforcement learns to love ugly truth. A seal should rip like paper, not peel like perfume. Newsrooms run drills now the way firehouses do. A producer calls out a cold, open reports of suspected tampering at 2 stores, no confirmed injuries, law enforcement en route. The team pulls a laminated checklist. Who is the authority? What are the lot codes? Where's the map? What can viewers do in 30 seconds that reduces risk? The anchor practices the only tone that works, calm as a seatbelt. A junior writer suggests a spicy, super likely tampering. The rundown editor kills it with a pencil line and a reminder that has kept communities safer than any tease clocks before adjectives. At corporate, the plant floor is the sermon. A line leader taps, caps the way a drummer checks a snare. Induction coils hum, shrink bands cling. Engineers argue over microns as if debating politics. In a conference room, a crisis comms template has 3 pages that didn't exist before 1982. What we know, what we don't, what you should do now. The CEO doesn't workshop talking points about reassurance. He rehearses the sentence that keeps trust alive. Here's how to inspect the package in your hand. The company's best ad is a camera pointed at the line, not a brand anthem. The lab is quieter and more consequential than any podium. A spectrophotometer chirps. An analyst logs a run with the calm of someone who knows how far numbers can travel when frightened people need them. On a whiteboard, a list of false positives we've seen saves a dozen news cycles a year. Down the bench, a younger chemist runs training on microcontamination, the ways a sloppy glove can turn a rumor into a headline. They say the same sentence every Friday because repetition is what keeps systems honest. Absence of evidence is instruction to keep looking where evidence would be. Retail learned the choreography of doubt and wrote it into policy. A clerk who sees a crooked band doesn't need to convince anybody. She scans a QR on the shelf tag, and a decision tree walks her to the phone. Managers keep a quiet bin-pulled product with a paper trail. Mirrors sit above aisles like patient teachers. Cameras tilt toward hands, not faces. Returns trigger a prompt for visual inspection. Store maps pull analgesics closer to staffed counters. The changes look like decor to customers. They are, in fact, design written in law. Law itself is the file's longest echo. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act grew case law around its bones. Definitions clarified, penalties, affirmed jury instructions, standardized. Prosecutors in other cities charge early behaviors that once lived in a gray zone. Defense attorneys still have oxygen, but less room. Judges teach juries the difference between tamper-resistant and tamper-evident with a specificity that would have felt like product placement in 1982 and feels like literacy now. The statute didn't solve this case. It prevented a dozen others from becoming it. Families teach the part no system can proportion. They set boundaries the film honors. They give interviews that refuse to turn grief into content. When they speak, they do it to aim the camera at habits, not at hurt. Check the seal. Ask the pharmacist. Throw it out if it feels wrong. Their restraint is a kind of governance, the ethical perimeter that keeps the genre from eating the story. Copycats, hoaxes, and scares will always ride the wake of a famous week. The difference now is procedural altitude. A hoax meets a statute. A scare meets a flowchart. A real threat meets a system that shouts. Anchors show the package, not the panic. Health departments push lot codes to feeds with a clarity that turns fear into action. The public, trained by repetition, responds like muscle memory: inspect, refuse, report, reset. What about the open file question? The face and motive. A story like this seems to owe investigators who carried the binder bind their answer to a principle. Documentaries rarely let breathe. Accuracy outranks catharsis. Randomness can be a strategy, not a shrug. Shelf-level tampering uses ordinary time and shared space to erase narrative. We solved the future, one detective says, not as a boast, but as a bill of lading, seals, bans, law training journalism that centers verbs while facts walk to the mic. He taps the binder not like a gavel, but like a metronome. The CODA for viewers is practical by design. It fits on a fridge and in a mind. Slow one beat. Inspect for band foil glued flap. Listen. Rings crack. Foils resist before they yield. Compare. Designs change. Suspicion doesn't. Refuse. Replacement costs less than regret. Report. Brand lot store time. You close circuits others built. Reset the house. Teach the click, like you teach a seatbelt. If that reads like advice and not cinema good. Weeks like the one Chicago lived don't deserve endless sequels. They deserve systems that make sequels boring to watch. Night again, any city. A pharmacist locks a gate, checks the analgesics aisle with the affection of a custodian and the suspicion of a detective. A cap sits just wrong. She pulls it, scans it, logs it, calls it. No one claps. In the morning, nobody gets harmed by that bottle. That's the quiet win, the one that never trends, never rolls live, never needs a press conference. A small subtraction from risk, a small addition to trust. Repeat until it looks like culture. The documentary promised not to invent an ending. It kept that promise. It offered instead the ending that already happened: law with teeth design that confesses journalism, that teaches retail, that doubts, labs that confirm families that set the tone, and an audience that learned a choreography small enough to live in a kitchen. The murderer who never saw a courtroom lost the only advantage randomness grants: the ability to repeat without the world shouting back. So, take the habit with you. Twist. Listen. Look. Refuse what won't confess. Report what does. Then, because the point of safety is ordinary life, take your medicine, take your breath, and take the day that a week in 1982 bought for you. 72 hours changed every medicine bottle in America. If this breakdown helped you see the case in a new light, hit, like, post your theory respectfully, and subscribe. Next up, another case where a single clue forced an industry to change.